Hi, everybody. This is Jimmy, and you're reading with Jimmy. This is the analysis of The Diary of a Madman, a summary, background, and interpretation. Hopefully, you read it with me. What a story! Diary of a Madman is a short story by Nikolai Gogol, published in 1835, as Zapinski Zumashado. Diary of a Madman, a first-person narrative presented in the form of diary narration. So what happened? Well, before I discuss that, I want to make a note about the translation. As we've seen in other English literature, classical non-English literature, a lot depends on the translator for determining the meaning of words. And the one we read was translated by Andrew McAndrew, a prolific translator of Russian authors and active in the later half of the 20th century. He died in 2001. He was a professor at the University of Virginia. And the reason I'm bringing him up now is that his translation of Gogol's Diary of a Madman, the narrator is never named. If you start looking around Google for information on the story, you'll suddenly be confronted with the name of the narrator. Poprishchin, one of the names. There's actually, the Russians like three names. Anyway, how can that be that he has a name in some translations and in others none? I thought that was an important question before we talk about what happens in the book. And the reason I chose McAndrew's translation is because I grew up with that version. And also I learned more and more about classical literature, especially other languages. I realized a lot, or if not everything, depends on the translator when you're reading non-English classics, like Gogol's story. And why he doesn't name their narrator, if indeed the name is Poprishchin is the name of the narrator, isn't critical. It is not critical to the appreciation or understanding of our story. And I would argue that not naming him makes him more of a universal kind of character, the man with no name, like the Clint Eastwood movie. In any case, McAndrew decided not to name him. And here's an example. In McAndrew's translation, he looked around and not seeing me, he began to call out. This is the scene where he's in Spain, quote, asylum. And first, this is the chancellor, the guy, the inquisitor. First, he shouted my name and civil service rank. I remained silent. And then Ferdinand VIII, King of Spain, and then he beats him, right? In other translations, it goes like this. When he did not see me, he began to call. At first he called, Poprishchin. I made no answer. And then he called, Avanti Ivanovich, titular counselor, nobleman. I kept silence. And then Ferdinand VIII, King of Spain. Finally, he called Ferdinand VIII. So you can see a big difference between McAndrew's and this other translations. And there's still other translations and other translations. The question you have to ask yourself when you're reading classical literature from a non-English source is, do you trust the translation? And frankly, any translation you read probably is pretty good unless it's an edited translation. Or, as we saw in Lysistrata and other non-English literature classics that we read, unless you read the original language, okay? The Jimmy rule of staying in the story for your analysis doesn't change, which means it doesn't matter if the guy's got a name or an unnamed narrator, whether you read a translation. The thing to remember is you're reading a translation and that you have to trust your translator, unless you can read the original Russian for yourself. And if you can read original Russian, my hat's off to you. I've always admired people who have a second language. I have trouble enough with English. So I stick with good, reliable translators. So let's see what happened. Let's analyze this story. And like always, let's start at the beginning. An extraordinary thing happened today. What is extraordinary? Extraordinary, as you'll find out, is something very right out of the ordinary, right? It's really different. And then he follows that sentence with, and it's October 3rd, so it's a diary. I got up rather late, and when Marva brought my boots, I asked her the time. Now, he says an extraordinary thing happened today, and since he slept late, Marva, who's Marva? Maybe his wife, maybe his servant. We find out it's if there's a servant who keeps usually these houses. I asked her the time. So was that the extraordinary thing? From the beginning, remember, I've told you when we analyze classical literature, the first sentence, the first paragraph, the first page, the first everything sets us up for what we're about to read, if you read carefully. That's why you got to go back and you have to analyze. And in this case, when we first read this, I don't think this is extraordinary that he asked her the time, because he got up rather late. Okay, so we find out later in this chapter, of course, the extraordinary thing are the dogs talking. When he hears the dogs talking, that's extraordinary. But he takes a long wind-up. In any case, I asked her the time, and hearing 10 had struck quite a while before, so he already knows he's late. He dressed in a hurry, and I must say I'd as soon have skipped the office altogether, knowing the sour look that the chief... I'm going to pause this for a moment. Okay. Sorry about that. Anyway, we left off, he sour looked the chief of his division. So that's his boss. For a long time now, he's been telling me, quote, so he's quoting his boss. How come, my man, you're always in such a muddle? Sometimes you dart around like a house on fire and you get your work in such a tangle. The devil himself couldn't put it straight. You're likely to start a new heading with a small letter and give no date or reference number. So he quotes his boss as telling him that he's running around like a chicken without a head. But we also find out from what he writes here that the boss says a little bit about what he does. He starts a new heading. So he's a civil service clerk, we come to find out later on. And that's what he does, is he copies documents, he gives reference number, he works in the civil service. This is way before fax machines, before Xerox machines, before internet. This is way before then, because this was published, as we saw in the beginning here, this was published in 1835. So you can imagine what's going on in 1835. Right? And if you can't imagine it, just go to Google and look it up. The vicious old crane, after he quotes his boss, he calls him in the diary, the vicious old crane, exclamation point. He, his boss, must envy me for sitting in the director's room and sharpening his quills. So the director is his boss's boss. Sharpening his quills. They used to write with quills. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. So I wouldn't have gone to the office if not in the hopes of seeing the cashier and trying to get a small advance on my salary out of the Jew. So there's a slant, right? Maybe he is Jewish. I don't know. What a creature he is. So now we've got this guy's an old crane. This guy's a creature. So we're starting to get a sense of what this guy's writing in his diary. One of the things I'm going to talk about when we finish our analysis, and I'm going to ask you if you keep a journal or a diary. And some of you will laugh at me and say, what are you talking about, Jimmy? Well, I'm here to tell you, you should keep a diary and journal. Now, why is that? Well, writing clarifies your thoughts. And as you write, you basically put down what's in your head, and it's a diary. It's personal. It's you in the diary, and you can express yourself. There's certain diaries lately that appeared that were left someplace, and suddenly they're public, and oh my God, look at all this stuff. So we don't want to write diaries and leave them public unless we want them to go public. But at the same time, writing does clarify. Google's title, Diary of a Madman, okay, it is interesting because he's telling you the guy is a madman, and it's a diary. So we're able to really peek into a guy's thoughts that's crazy, perhaps. Now, we have to prove that by reading. And if you read the story with me, you can clearly see that the guy goes off the deep end. Is he already off the deep end here? That's the question you have to ask yourself. So this is October 3rd, and by January, he's gone off the deep end. In any case, so given the hoary monster, he's basically going, what, the last judgment will come before you'll get a month's pay in advance from him. So he's looking for an advance, which, you look for an advance when you're short of money. Even if there's a dire emergency, you can beg, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So he's calling people names. He's going to the office. He's not really, it doesn't seem like he wants to work, but in his diary, he expresses himself and the people around him. He may be wearing, right there, you may see someone nesting. So it's not like working at the city administration or justice department. So he's talking about his department. I see no advantage in working in our department. No side benefits. It's not like working here or here. You may see someone nesting in a corner, scribbling away like he does. And he may be wearing a shabby coat and have a snout that you'd want to spit at, perhaps like he does. But then take a look at the summer house he rents. So he's saying there's other places you can work that have people a little better off than he is. So what happens? This basically sets you up for the entire rest of the story, which is why it's first person narration, right? He's inside the story. And what happens is a civil service clerk descends into madness. We watch as he writes in his diary what he sees and does. And in my opinion, it's actually a sad story. One like The Horla by Maupassant, which we also read on this website. If you haven't read it, I encourage you to read it. Because what these stories do is they give us a glimpse into the mind of someone going insane. I mean, I'd say, well, what good is that, Jimmy? Well, who cares about crazy people? Well, we're all a little off, ladies and gentlemen. The mind is a tricky thing. You have all these thoughts floating around, coming in and out of your thinking, and your senses feed your mind with impressions, and you form perceptions, and blah, 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 right? You try to figure out this, you try to figure out that, and it's a wonder, in my opinion, that you can make sense of anything. What a marvel. Seriously. It's amazing, the human mind. And the more we know about it, and here's a chance because someone wrote a diary that theoretically is a madman. So we get a chance to see his thoughts, his feelings. So they help us judge reality. Remember, you're reading to learn how other people lead their lives and how to lead yours. That's why you read classical literature. So they help us judge reality, and we can see what another person is seeing, hearing, and feeling, especially when he's inside the story. Right? You never can see, you never know what another person is thinking. Next time you go to the supermarket, walk down the aisle and try to figure out what people are thinking. You can't do it because their heads are not glass. You don't know what they're thinking. They don't know what you're thinking. So it's a very strange feeling when you start realizing you don't know what a person's thinking. So a diary, which is very personal, is where people put down their thoughts. They let you into their minds, if that's possible. And remember, like I said, you read to see how other people lead their lives. And if you've dealt with someone who's losing or lost their sense of reality, i.e. Alzheimer's, or something tragic happens and they get amnesia or something. If like I said, the mind is is a beautiful marvel of nature, but it's also very delicate, isn't it? Anything can happen. So if you dealt with people like this, like imagine someone coming up to you and saying they heard some dogs talking, right? You'd say, whoa. But maybe they did in their mind, because perception is reality. Don't forget that. That's an advertising saying. Perception is reality. What you perceive becomes your reality. So if you've dealt with someone like this story, Diary of a Madman, paints a picture of what might be happening in a person's mind. And it should at least evoke in you empathy. Look up the word empathy. Because when reality leaves us, when we lose our sense of reality, it's a very sad thing. So, the first page, first sentence, first paragraph, we find it's a first-person narrator. Marv is his caretaker, chief, cashier. And now what the director says about the narrator. This is very important. And you're going to ask yourself, well, why does he record what his boss says it about him? Well, it's his diary. He wants to put it down as he perceives it. And can we believe what he says? Well, we have to believe what he says. Well, Jimmy, didn't you tell me that a first-person narrator, if we catch him in a lie, that he's an unreliable narrator? We're going to talk about that, because he is an unreliable narrator. But the beauty of this story, the unbelievable insight Gogol had in writing this story and in putting the narrator in the first person into diary narration, is that he uses unreliability to a great advantage. And he becomes, in his unreliability, he becomes the reliable narrator of what's happening in a guy's mind who's losing it. It's a very complex point of view, but it's unbelievable. The guy has enormous talent, and that's why I like McAndrew's translation. Anyway, so we learn about people from what they say about other people. Other people talk about you, you talk about other people, you form opinions. So when he writes down what his boss says about him, he's in such a muddle. You know what a muddle is? Look up the word muddle. It's like he's distraught. He's like confused, right? He's confused. Runs around like a house on fire, can't get his work done. So the narrator, have you ever written down what you thought people told you? Is it accurate? I did a Google review once for a guy, and he accused me of taping the encounter. I took the review down. It's a long story. I don't have a photographic memory, but when I'm in an encounter, I listen very carefully to what people say, how they say it, and what they say. And then I immediately go back, especially in this case, it was an encounter over a purchase, right? The guy wouldn't wouldn't give me my money back on faulty equipment, okay? He just wouldn't do it. Can't do it. He said I'd set a precedent. So I wrote this down, I put it up in a review, and then we exchanged comments and on that review. And he accused me basically of taping him without knowledge that he's being taped. He was a little off, I think. Or you can say I was a little off because I did write it down. In any case, have you ever written it down? And if you wrote it down, is it accurate? Is it accurate when he says, the vicious old crane? Is his boss vicious for telling him he's running around, he's making mistakes? Is he a vicious old crane? Well, he's calling him a name, Jimmy. Well, of course he is. Sticks and stones will hurt my bones, but names will never hurt me, right? So he's actually expressing himself by quoting his boss. He gives us an insight into what he's thinking and what he is, right? So many narrators are different, but the first thing you want to know about first-person narrator is they are in the story. Remember that. First person is in. He writes about his boss, vicious old crane, and he must envy me. Do you know what envy is? Now, when he says he must envy him for sitting in the director's room and sharpening his quills, that's an insight into this guy's character, right? I don't think the boss envies him for sharpening a guy's quills. Well, what's sharpening a quill, Jim? Well, it's basically they used to write with quills, bird's feathers. I'm going to show you what that is right here, a history of quill pens. I'm not going to ask you to read it, but they used to sharpen quills. So they would write, right? And I do not think, but what is envy and what is a muddle? What is this? What's going on? Well, envy is an emotion which happens when a person lacks another's quality, skill, achievement, possession, and wishes that the other lacked it or that he had it. In other words, Aristotle said envy is pain at the sight of another's good fortune, stirred by those who have what we ought to have. So he thinks the director is envious of him because he sharpens his boss's quills. I don't know. Maybe he envies his boss. As you'll see, if you read the story with me, envy is what the narrator is guilty of, right? He has envy. He envies the upper class. You have to read a little bit about Russia in 1835. This is pre-revolution of the communist revolution when it happens decades later. But there was social classes, right? And he's a civil service clerk. He's not a boss. He's not a manager, and he's not rich. He works for a living, which is okay. Working is good. It's therapy, right? But envy is one of the 7 deadly sins. What are the 7 deadly sins? It's a set of vices that originated in Christian theology. The Russians were Orthodox Christians, right? They were Christians. And the 7 deadly sins were envy, gluttony, greed, lust, pride, and sloth. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, wrath. Okay. So you can read the definitions of these 7. There was a movie with Kevin Spacey about this, I think, and Brad Pitt. Oh, what the heck was it? I can't remember it. Anyway, does the director envy the narrator? I don't think so. Or does the narrator envy others? I think so. If you read the story with me, and hopefully you did, so you're reading this analysis after you read the story. Otherwise, you got to go back and reread it. I think the narrator envies others, which is okay. It's okay to envy, but it's really not good because then you start getting goofy in your head, right? These are important questions to ask yourself as it unfolds, and you answer them with evidence. Ladies and gentlemen, evidence. We need evidence to answer the story. Evidence. Proof. Here's a history of the quill pens, and you can read about this, or just Google history of quill pens, and you can read about it. The narrator goes on to talk about the work and advance in salary. The argument can be made that Google's story is a prelude to what's called the stream of consciousness technique. I want to talk about that for a couple of minutes because stream of consciousness was really credited to a guy by the name of James Joyce, who was an Irish novelist, poet, literary critic, etc., blah, blah, blah. And he wrote the book Ulysses. We will not, I repeat, we will not be reading Ulysses. It's too long, too deep, too really. I would have to devote a whole website to Ulysses. You should read it because it has every type of narration, including dire narration, possible in the English language. This is why when I was an instructor, one of the things I was going to do, if I were ever to have instructed in college, which I did not, I was a high school teacher, right, was to use, and actually a college teacher, but not, it was a junior college teacher. I would be using Ulysses as my grammar book. It's the most fundamental grammar book you can have. Every type of narration style is in that book. And James Joyce was pretty much a genius. I think what we'll do is we're going to read one of his short stories. But in any case, this new technique was called stream of consciousness, and it emulates how we think. Well, what does that mean, Jimmy? Well, when you're thinking in your head, you're not punctuating, are you? You don't end the sentence with a period. You don't say, I see the sun's shining today, period. And then you don't do that. You punctuate with modulating your voice, but you don't use punctuation. And stream of consciousness or interior monologue emulates that. There's very little punctuation. It's just thoughts. And the diary narration comes very close to stream of consciousness because the guy's writing in a diary his thoughts. So he jumps around a lot. And diaries do that. Diary narration does jump around a lot. Here's something from Ulysses. Widower I hate to see, looks so forlorn. Poor man, O'Connor wife, and 5 children poisoned by mussels here. The sewage, hopelessness. Some good matronly woman in a pork pie hat to mother him. Take him to tow, platter face, and a large apron. Ladies' gray flannel bloomers, 3 shillings a pair. Astonishing bargain. Plain and loved forever, they say. Ugly, no woman thinks she is. Love, lie, and be handsome, for tomorrow we die. See him sometimes walking. You get the picture? This is just on and on. Look at this. U period, P period, colon, up. Tried about see him sometimes walking about trying to find out who played the trick. Up. Fate, that is. He, not me. Also a shop often noticed. Curse seems to dog it. Dreamt last night? Wait. Something confused. She had red slippers on. Turkish? You can almost, if you read this long enough, you're in the person's mind. Follow your own thoughts one day and how they hop around based on what your senses are feeding you. That's what's going on here. The narrator senses are in full activation, and they're feeding this narrator the thoughts, right? Her thoughts, his thoughts. And so that's important to understand. In a diary, you're reading the thoughts of a person. And sometimes, as he just did on the first page, he quotes somebody. All right. So the diary of Madman is like that. We get into his thoughts, and there's no evidence to say that he is or not recording them accurately, which makes a powerful statement into the mind. Here's another piece of the beginning to show us this. This continues after he's talking about the cashier. He'll strip a petitioner naked, except for the shirt. On the other hand, remember he's talking about other departments. To work in our department carries more prestige. Aha. The people of the city administration, the other departments, have never dreamt of such cleanliness where he works. And then we have red mahogany tables, and our superiors always address us politely. Yes, if it weren't for the prestige, I confess I would have left the department long ago. So now he's telling us in his diary, confessing to us, he's here for the prestige. He expresses his opinion and tells us why he's working. So prestige means wide respect and admiration that you feel for someone or something on the basis of perception, right? Of their achievements or quality. Perception. Remember what I just told you. Perception is reality. Jimmy's red-green colorblind. Jimmy just told his wife this morning that, that pot that we replanted, the pot we put in the garage was blue, but it was green, she said. I said, oh, okay, because I can't see red and green. Unless I have a comparison contrast next to it, it's going to be very difficult for me to call a color that's red or green. Well, what do you mean, Jimmy? Well, I don't know. It's something in my eyes. But my perception of those two colors are very different than yours. I don't see them as your red or my red. In fact, no one sees pure red, pure blue. We all have different spectrums in our eye. So perception of the narrator on what he's talking about with prestige is his perception. In other words, pride, right? prestige of their achievements. Pride. It's another one of those sins. I'm not saying that the story is about the 7 deadly sins, but I am saying that the narrator explains a lot about himself and how he feels about people and things. And so should you. Maybe. As for the decent people, there was only our kind, the civil service clerk squelching along. This is when he's walking down the street, before he hears the dogs talk. He's walking. As for decent people, there were only our kind, the civil service clerk. So he considers himself a decent person, squelching along. I saw him at the street crossing. As soon as I saw him, I said to myself, you're not on your way to the office. You're after that one trotting ahead over there, and it's her legs you're staring at. What a rogue, your civil servant. He's a civil servant. Who's him? What is the pronoun him referring to, ladies and gentlemen? I saw him, and I said to myself, look at I, myself, him, myself. You're not on your way, my man. You're after that one. You're after that Scotty, all right? He'll try to pick up anything under a bonnet. What a rogue he is, right? I'm passing by a store thinking about it when a carriage stops in front of it. So he's thinking about all this as he's walking to work. When you're walking to work, when you're at work, when you're riding to work on the train, if you don't work, when you go, what do you think about? What do you think about? Have you ever thought about what you think about? Or do you just think about I got to buy a can of Budweiser? A civil service clerk. I think he's talking about himself. He's a civil service clerk. And what is the narrator? A civil service clerk. So I think he's talking about himself. You may not think that. You may, Jimmy, you're reading too much into it. Fine. That's okay too. Because he's still telling us what he's observing. And he's observing people like himself. People like himself. Remember, this guy does a lot of comparison with himself to other people. Always comparing himself. Probably what drives him nuts. I don't know. So he's projecting, like all of us do from time to time. He's projecting what he is to other people. Are all civil service clerks ready to pick up anything under a bonnet? I don't know. I don't think so. But projection, he's projecting. What is projection? Projection, right? So the psychologists say is the defense mechanisms of coping according to psychologists. People may use this defense mechanism or unconscious mental strategies to cope with stressful or anxiety-provoking thoughts and experiences, so they say. I'm just saying a lot of times we project what we believe to other people, which could get you in trouble or not. Not everybody's like you, ladies and gentlemen. Not everybody's like me. Not everybody's like this guy, the unnamed narrator. And that's a good thing because we're all different. We all, right? But projection is when you start imposing what you are as a defense mechanism. They're all like that. Oh, I thought this, so they must all think like that. All people like me must think like that. That's not true because we're all different. We don't want to get too deep into analysis of projection and start arguments with psychologists, but it's important to understand a little bit about this because that is what the narrator is doing. He's projecting his feelings to the people around him. He projected immediately when the boss, he recorded his bosses telling him he's in a muddle and disturbing that, a vicious old crane. He's just jealous. He's envious of me sharpening the quills. That's projection. He's projecting what he takes great pride in sharpening his boss's quills. So when someone unconsciously attributes their thoughts, feelings, or behaviors to another person, they're projecting. Your partner may feel jealous in your relationship, but may accuse you of being jealous. They feel jealous, they accuse you of being jealous. In that example, your partner is projecting. Say that's an example. You can Google, you can study projection. We all project, right? The idea of living, however, is to accept who you are the way you are, which is difficult, very difficult, very difficult. The narrator's projecting himself and others as a rogue, right? A rogue is a dishonest, unprincipled person. Is he? I don't know. You read the story. I don't think he is. Is he saying that himself? Let's read further and get the reactions to the director's daughter. I'm not going to reread the whole story here, just pieces. So he's in front. The carriage shows up. The director daughter, Sophie, we find out her name is later, it gets out of the thing. He pressed himself against the wall. Very, very important sentence. Very important admission in his diary. I pressed myself against the wall. He's confessing to us what he did when he saw it was the director's daughter. The footman opened the carriage. She fluttered out like a little bird. Fluttered out like a little bird. How she looked. First right, then left. Her eyes and eyebrows flashed past her. Oh, God, I'm lost forever. Why is he lost forever? If she sees him, right? He's pressed against the wall. God, don't let her see me. And yet, you'll find out if you read the story, he goes to the director's house. She does see him. She knows who he is. He works there for her father. And why did she have to drive out in the pouring rain? Tried to deny after that women have a passion for clothing. So he's see how he's just going and rationalizing why she's out there in the rain. Passion for clothing. She did not recognize me. Okay? He says that for obvious reasons. Her eyes flashed past him. She didn't acknowledge him. And you'll find out if you read the story with me that she does know him, but she didn't recognize him. And he says that in the diary. Did she? Well, Jimmy, if she's an unreliable narrator, how do we know she didn't recognize him? We'll find out. He believes perception is reality. She didn't recognize him. Besides, I was trying to hide myself. He admits it, right? I pressed myself against the wall. I'm trying to hide myself. My coat was quite stained and out of fashion. He's embarrassed. Then he talks about coats and collars. And then the door, she goes into the store. The door was open and had to stay in the street. The dog, the lap dog. I know this little dog. How does he know the little dog? Well, because he basically, right, he goes to the house. He sharpens the guy's quills, and that little dog lives there with Sophie. So this is very important, what I summarize here. And then he starts hearing the dogs talk. This is important to understand his descent into madness. This is where it starts. He starts hearing dogs talk, right? Maybe this was happening before December, his first entry. We don't know. We don't care. We're in the story. We're using the evidence of the story. So he hears the dog talking. She's called Madge. A minute or so later, I heard a thin little voice. Hello, Madge. I'll be damned. Who's that talking? You see how this emulates stream of consciousness? Suddenly, he's writing in his diary, but now we're in his head. I turned and saw two ladies walking under their umbrellas, one old, the other young and pretty. See how he talks about that? But they had already passed when I heard again just next to me, you ought to be ashamed, Madge. What on earth was going on? I saw Madge and the dog that had been following the two ladies sniffing at one another. Maybe I'm drunk, I said. You see, suddenly this beautiful technique of diary narration is suddenly we're in the guy's head, and he's telling us what he's perceiving. If I'm going to make a statement right now, it just came to me. If all of us started talking about our perceptions to people, I would suspect that all of us would be judged a little off. If you know what I'm saying. If you've heard of a Rorschach test, what's a Rorschach test? Look it up. It's a test. It's an ink blot test. It's where people and psychologists go and they look at ink blots, and then you tell the psychologist what you see. You project, you basically interpret the ink blot. You can do this with clouds. Look at clouds sometime. Oh, look at that. There's a caterpillar. Or whatever you see in the cloud. You see what you want to see, don't you? You see what your senses tell you you can see. I can't see red, green, so I can never tell you I saw a red bonnet unless it's my red. Anyway, the narrator records these two dogs talking. Did you ever hear dogs talk? Do dogs talk? There was a research project at the University of Notre Dame once where the professor told the students to go and research pet owners. They wanted to find out the bond between pet owners. So what the research students did is they went out, they observed pet owners, they came back with their papers. And then the instructor read all the papers, and then he said, I'm going to flunk all of you. What do you mean? The students reacted violently. He said, well, I told you to research, all you did is observe and talk to you didn't talk to the dogs. And the student said, what are you talking about, Professor? This is actually a true story. So he says, if you're going to research pet owners, you have to talk to the pets. They said, this is BS. And so, after discussing it, he says, well, you're not going to pass the course unless you redo the research. So these students had to go back and make arrangements then again with the people they were interviewing before, and they started researching it. So, and the story goes, and this is true, as they started to talk to the pets, they said, do you like your life with so-and-so? The owners would speak for the pets. I love my kibbles. I'm not kidding. Now, I don't own a pet. I've had goldfish when I was a kid. I had a dog that we gave away because he tore up the linoleum one night. There are people who coddle, who love their pets, talk to their pets. In their minds, their pets talk back to them when they look at them, when they lick their face. Maybe that's the way they communicate. I don't know. But if you saw what I see sometimes where I live now, how people treat their pets, I would say they're a little off. I'm talking, maybe not. What are you talking about? A pet is a beautiful thing, Jimmy. Of course it is. But I mistakenly saw a young couple with a baby carriage, and I thought the baby was a baby, but when I looked in the carriage, it was a dog. I'm telling you, it's very strange, right? Now that it wasn't a perception; that was the reality. There was a dog in the carriage. In any case, I don't hear dogs talk. And if somebody came up to me and said, I heard a couple of dogs talking the other day, I'd say, well, I don't know. Did you ever see children play? Children play, they talk they personify, they project into the characters that they're talking about with their dolls, with animals, with blocks sometimes. So if you read what the narrator wrote in here, he starts listening to these dogs talk. He says, Maggie was forming the words. I was bow wow. I was bow wow wow, very sick. He puts it bow wow. Talk about a lap dog. This is actually a humorous story in a way, right? But it's not. It's a sad story. I was quite surprised to hear it. Later, however, when I sized up the situation, I was not surprised anymore. I've heard that in England, a fish broke the surface and uttered a couple of words that was such outlandish that scholars have been trying to work out their meaning for 3 He heard this, right? And then I read in newspapers about 2 cows who went into a store and asked for a pound of tea. I was much more bewildered when Madge said, I did write to you, Fidel. Here's where he starts flipping out really well, right? Now I'd be willing to forfeit a month's pay if I ever heard of a dog that could write. Only gentlemen can write. That's him, right? So he rationalizes hearing dogs talk. And don't forget what he does for a living. He writes things. So is this guy really mad? Yeah, of course he is. But is he really? I mean, his perception is these dogs are talking, then they talk about writing, and that's where he draws the line. Let me give you an example, if he's mad or not. Well, Jimmy, of course he's mad. Dogs don't talk. What are you, stupid? Hold on. Galileo, you know who this is? You know who Galileo is? Some of you do, some of you don't. Galileo Galilei. He didn't invent the telescope, but he did design and build telescopes, better telescopes, and he made observations. And he actually changed what people believed. Up until Galileo, people believed that the earth was the center of the universe. This is what they believed. They taught this in schools. They believed everything went around us. It's pretty self-serving, but that's what they believed. Here comes Galileo, and he observes that the earth goes around the sun. And he's basically saying, you got it wrong. We're actually going around the sun. And today, that's what you believe. And it's easy to believe why you would believe the earth is the center of the universe and that the sun goes around us. Because if you look at the sun, it moves across the sky. You're spinning around the earth right now at 26,000 miles, I think, right? But you don't know that because A, the earth's so big, and B, gravity, lots of reasons why you don't know you're moving. But you're moving. You're not only moving, you're going in a circle, right? That's why you have day and night. But you're whipping around the sun, and the sun is actually moving too. The whole solar system is moving. I'm getting dizzy talking about it, right? But what he observed is the opposite of what people believed. People did not believe this. He observed this, and he proved it mathematically by looking at the motion of the stars. So when he started to talk about these things, the church wanted to burn him at the stake for being a heretic. It's a true story, right? You can look it up, Google it. When he started to tell people what he perceived and what he saw, they wanted to burn him. They wanted to kill him. They didn't believe him. On February 26th, Galileo was formally banned and banished from the Roman Catholic Church, and he spent the rest of his life under house arrest. Can you imagine that? They wanted to burn this guy for the truth. What we know now today is the truth. And Jimmy is not saying that dogs talk. Jimmy's saying perception is reality. And before you start saying that your perceptions are better than another person's or are more accurate than another person's, you got to take stock of what you're perceiving and just understand that you might be wrong. The reason I told you this story is that most of us realize dogs don't talk, much less write. So if a person like the narrator is recording these things outwardly, he's not acting what he's telling you in his mind yet, is he? Therein lies the story. Therein lies the story. You can think what you want, you can write what you want, but if you start acting out misperceptions, if you start going around and telling people that you heard dogs talking, something's gonna happen. Maybe not nowadays because a lot of that crap is going on, but something's gonna happen, right? Maybe it's a drug-induced euphoria you're feeling, right? Drugs do weird things to you. Don't take drugs. Herein lies our definition of mad. So if people's behavior is different than what most of us consider normal, that's when the word mad is used. You're crazy. How have you used that? You're crazy for believing what you believe, for doing what you do. You're crazy. How can you do that? You're crazy. It's a strong word, right? And the more you use it, the more bastardized it becomes, the more normal it seems. But what is normal? We don't want to get too far out. But Galileo was not mad. He wasn't mad, even though some people still think that the earth is the center of the universe. I'm most important. No, you're not. No, you're not. None of us are. We're just a speck, right? We're one person in a sea of people. In fact, one prominent politician, this is a true story, look it up. One prominent politician said a while ago that the island of Guam might capsize because you're having too many people living there. I'm not kidding. Google it. When that person said that, was he mad? Was he insane, or was he just stupid? I think he was just stupid. So there's a fine line between stupid and nuts. Would you agree with me on that? So when somebody says something stupid, don't say he's nuts. Evidence must be gathered, okay? All right. So there's more evidence here. He follows the dogs. He goes to the 5th floor. The ladies went up to the 5th floor. I mean, he's following them. Now, obviously, they didn't turn around and say, "Why are you following me?" But he followed them. You start following people nowadays, you can get a lot of trouble, right? Fine, I won't go in now. I'll make a note. And he does make a note. But later on, when he goes to find the letters that the dogs wrote, he reached the 6th floor. So he follows them to the 5th floor, but he goes back to the 6th floor. This is what Jimmy calls evidence in the story. This is evidence that the guy is truly losing it, right? Because if you were in your quote unquote right mind and you follow people for whatever reason, a private detective follows a person to the 5th floor, he doesn't go to the 6th floor. And when you look at this scene, when he reaches the 6th floor, a girl with freckles came out, not too bad looking. I recognized her at once. She was the one I had been walking with the old woman. Is that true or not? I don't know if it can be true because he's on the 6th floor. It doesn't matter. We're reading about a guy who's lost it. And that's what you have to, that's the beauty of Gogol. Not Google. Please forgive me. Gogol. Is that he uses the unreliability of the narrator in a very dramatic way to give us really what this guy's looking at. She was the one I'd been watching. She blushed a little, and I immediately saw through her. I saw through her. She blushed. Why did she blush? What do you do when you blush? Turn red, right? I blush. I don't know, because I can't see myself, and even when people see me, you're turning red. I go, I don't know. Sometimes you can't control your blush. What you need, my dear, is a husband. He says that right in his diary, but he's thinking that. See how stream of consciousness creeps in? What do you want, she asks. And he says, I want to have a talk with your doggy. She freaks out. Okay. Reliability of the narrator. We've talked about this before when we read stories together, but I want to take a moment now because of the fact that Gogol uses the unreliability of the narrator to make him, in my opinion, one of the most unreliable narrators I've ever met in literature. He is. He's one of the most unreliable narrators, if there's such a thing. Wayne C. Booth knew a lot about narrators. In his book, The Rhetoric of Fiction, which you can probably still buy, it's a thick volume, but I read it, I studied it in my literature. He's a very smart guy, and he made an impression on me by distinguishing between first and third person. He says, whether or not they are involved in action as agents or as sufferers, narrators and third-person reflectors differ markedly according to the degree and kind of distance that separates them from the author, the reader, and the other characters in the story. Remember, Wayne C. Booth is a professor, so he writes like an academic. What is he saying here? There's first person and third person. He calls them reflectors. These are the omniscient narrators that we have to believe if we're going to believe the story. And in this case, the anonymous civil clerk narrator in this story differs markedly from the narrator, for example, if you read Johnny Bear With Me. That narrator is in the story, and that narrator is very different than this narrator. First of all, the technique is different. It's not a diary. It's a story. So the technique of the story now we're learning, you should have learned, actually helps us understand the story better. And it was chosen by the author. Jimmy doesn't like to talk about the author because he likes to stay in the story, talk about the evidence of the story. But in this case, because of the unreliability of the madman, the civil service clerk, anonymous narrator, we really want to understand narrators a little bit better. So he's a scholar and he offers you, but Jimmy has boiled it down to first and third person narrators, inside, outside. Simply, narrators inside the story, he's a character among the characters. He's one of them. And in this case, in his diary, he's one of them. But the diary is a very personal stream of consciousness type technique. He's not really, you can only know the other characters through what he tells you, which is true in all first-person narration, right? But the diary is different because it's a personal journal. If he's outside the story, he's a reflector, and you have to believe what he says. But you can clearly see the difference now in the first and third person narrators and how they narrate, what they tell us, how they tell us. The types of narration differ. This is diary narration, and we're reading what he thinks. Therefore, the anonymous civil service clerk might or might not be reliable. Now, you've read the entire story, and it's clear his unreliability shows, right? Dogs don't talk. They don't write letters. But it's only when he starts acting out, outside his diary, that he starts to look like he's mad. He walks to the girl's door we just saw, and she says, what do you want? He says, I want to have a little talk with your doggy. And he bursts in the room. The dog bites him. It's an unbelievable scene, right? The dog bites his calf. Then he finds out where the dog sleeps. He reaches under and he grabs a bunch of papers. Do you think those are the letters? What do you think they put paper in a dog's sleeping area for? What do you think that? Make it a little soft in case an accident happens? So the unreliability is what makes his narration so powerful. So powerful. He's given us profound insight into a madman. You won't find this if you have experience with people who are losing it through Alzheimer's or something. You can't possibly fathom what's in their head. You just don't know. What comes out of their mouth is often irrational, right? You don't know. But to them, it's very real. It's very real. So, is it imagination and not just madness? You've watched children play. We talked about that, right? Does your age matter when you make breaks from reality? What is reality? I could go on and on and on, but I'm not going to. He's not always a reliable narrator, but then why should we believe anything he says? The answer is with the evidence. In his diary, he's telling us what's inside his head. And throughout the diary, he sprinkles reality of outside. And we're going to talk about that. He presses himself against the wall. He's telling us what he did. He doesn't want to be seen by her. He's got an old coat on, right? And he ends up being, the king of Spain, the king of Spain. Is he the king of Spain? In his mind, he is, but in reality, of course, he's not. And that's the difference between people who have lost their sense of reality, of most people's reality. Most people, the normal reality, right? I could say I'm the king of Spain. It wouldn't mean much, right? So how we see things around him influences his madness. I'm not going to go into this. So he reads He goes and he gets the dog's letters. That's a funny scene. Who wrote the dog's letters? Because he starts recording them on November 13th. Who wrote those letters, ladies and gentlemen? Did the dog write those letters? I don't think so. So who wrote the letters? He did. In his diary. This is a story inside a story. This is an unbelievable master craftsman at work with words. And McAndrew is to be complimented on his translation. This is a story. He's reading these letters that he himself, the madman, right, the civil service clerk, wrote. And as you read these letters, okay, and read what he says about the dog's letters, you're getting a sense now of not only who he is, but how deeply disturbed that he is. Just look at this. My young mistress, whom her papa calls Sophie. That's when we first realize her name. Papa is who? The director that he sharpens clothes for is crazy about me. The dog, Madge, is writing this, that her mistress, Sophie, is crazy about me. And what does the narrator say? Ouch! Never mind, silence. He's just, right? He wants to be thought of Sophie. If you look at the scenes with him and Sophie, he wants to be liked by Sophie. He's a civil service clerk, so that will be impossible. But that's what he wants. He wants to be liked by her. And the dog liking her hurts him. And so on. Then Papa goes around and will I get it or not? He says to the dog. He talks to the dog. Remember, we talked about this. The father, he speaks very little. He stopped saying to himself, will I get it or not? Once he even asked me, what do you say, Madge? Will I get it or won't I? Madge says, I could make no sense of it, so I smelled the shoe. I smelled the shoe and left the room. If you were going to be a dog, if you were going to tell a story from a dog's point of view, isn't that what you would do? Isn't that what you would do? What a creative guy, huh? So he gets a ribbon, he gets an award or something. Maggie says, I sniffed it, but it had no fragrance. And finally, I gave it a lick and it was slightly, I don't know. Who's writing these letters? So he writes some more, he reads some more. This is very important because suddenly we're going to see some insight into who he really is. Reality is setting in here. You see, he's struggling between perception and reality, as we all do, don't we? Sometimes we think we're more than we are, less than we are. It's hard to imagine what exactly we are, isn't it? So he agrees something's wrong. Why should she like this officer? Remember the officer that she ends up with? The dog says if she likes the officer, I think she'll soon be liking the civil service clerk who sits in Papa's study. So who is that? That's him. And he's writing from the dog's point of view a letter about himself. Perhaps because he can't confront himself. That one, my dear, is a real scarecrow. Have you ever been described as a scarecrow? So the dog is describing him as a scarecrow. He's writing the dog's letter. He's describing himself. He looks a bit like a turtle caught in a bag. And he says, which clerk can that be? So at first, he doesn't recognize himself. Don't forget, he's writing the dog's letter, right? He's writing the letter as a dog. And then he doesn't know it's him, although he does. He has a funny name, and he's always sitting sharpening quills. The hair on his head is like straw. Papa sends him on errands like a servant. The filthy cur, remember the vicious crane? Now it's the filthy cur. Why is my hair like straw? Sophie can hardly control her laughter when she sees him. You wretched lying dog! What a filthy, poisonous tongue. I recognize the hand of my boss here. He's rationalizing, right? It's his boss. Somehow he got to the dog. For some reason, the man has sworn undying hatred for me. Because remember, he says, grow up. I see you chasing after Sophie, right? The director's daughter. Still, let's see one more letter. It might make it clear. So he reads this letter about the officer that's courting, that's the officer that's courting Sophie. Hell, I can't go on. High official, see, there's that envy, the best things in the world. You discover a crumb of happiness. What's his crumb of happiness? What's his crumb? That he gets to sharpen quills in the director's office and sees Sophie from a distance. Remember the scene where she dropped her handkerchief? Oh, what a hanky, he says. That's his crumb of happiness. His crumb is being able to sharpen his boss's boss quills. Oh my gosh. Can you imagine? What's your crumb of happiness? What makes you happy? That's his crumb. And then comes a high official and snatches, God damn it, I would so much like to become a high official and not just obtain her hand in marriage either. So he's thinking of marrying her in his head. He's thinking of marrying her. He has no chance, but he's thinking about it, right? I'm gonna step over. Don't go away. Don't go away. It just dawned on me that one of Sigmund Freud's quotes that I want to quote to you right now, I'm reading it from one of my notebooks. Sigmund Freud said, all who wish to reach a higher standard than their constitution will allow fall victims to neurosis. It would have been better for them if they could have remained less perfect. Sometimes you got to accept the, reality, right? Reality has a way of doing this, and he can't. And I feel sorry for this guy because he can't do it. He can't do it. And he starts just going off the deep. Oh, hell, I tore the stupid dog's letters to shreds. So he finds out Sophie's getting married, questions why he's a clerk, reads about Spain, has no heir, right? Spain has no heir. It's got a woman. How can the woman be a king? Then he flips. He flips when you Martrober 86 between day and night. There it is. He's gone. He's gone. He starts acting out. What's it's in his head. He hasn't gone to work for over 3 weeks. His boss sent someone over to make him go to the office. So he goes over to the office, and he doesn't tell anybody he's the king of Spain. Yeah, right? I didn't stir. I didn't let him know who's around him, right? I didn't even stir. Then the director was on his way, his boss's boss, where he used to sharpen quills. Clerks jumped up, but I didn't budge. He's the king of Spain, right? He's an old clerk, not a director. He doesn't see how he's categorized everybody now. They gave me a paper to sign. They expected me to sign it in the corner, head clerk such and such, because he's a civil service clerk, right? Well, let them think that I wrote in the main space, Ferdinand VIII. You see, you should have witnessed the awed silence that followed. They're not silencing in awe, are they? Maybe it is awe. But I merely waved my hand graciously, dispense with the manifestations, right, of allegiance, and I walked out of the room. Then he goes right to the director's house. Right? He hasn't been out of his house in 3 weeks. He goes there. Right? The footman tried to stop him, but what I said to him made his arms drop limp. You can imagine what he said to him. He went right to her boudoir, right? To her, and there she is. And he says, I didn't tell her I was the king of Spain. I didn't tell her. He told her that she couldn't even imagine the happiness of waiting for her. Despite the enemy's intrigues, we would be together. I didn't want to say any more, so he left. So, man, he bursts into her bedroom and says that to her. We'll be together. Don't worry about it. And then he talks about women being perfidious. Now I understand what a woman is like. Why is he talking like this? Because she probably looked at him like he's nuts, which he is, right? But he's saying women is in love with the devil. He starts rationalizing, justifying all those who lick boots and proclaim their patriotism, blah, blah, blah. All of this crazy ambition and vanity come from a little bubble under the tongue. And he starts projecting, okay, next, no date, a day without a date. He goes along. He's still running around, right? He goes incognito. The Tsar was riding past. The Tsar is the top guy, right? He's like the king of Russia. Everybody was doffing his hat, and so did I. I gave no sign that I was the king of Spain. I thought it would be undignified to reveal my identity. If only I could get hold of a royal mantle. He doesn't know why the Spanish attire hasn't arrived yet. Tailors are so stupid. So there he goes again, right? I decided to make a mantle out of my best coat, which I had worn only twice. So he's got an old coat, a new coat. So he, good for nothing, mess it up. I did it myself. I locked the door. I cut my coat to ribbons with scissors, since a mantle has a completely different style. Can't remember the day, the month. The mantle's ready. Marva really let out a yell when I put it on. You think? Even so, I still didn't feel ready to be presented at court. My retinue hasn't arrived. Blah, blah, blah. Okay. I don't know why my retinue is delayed. Madrid, February. He's in Spain. He doesn't know how it happened. They went so fast. In a half hour, they reached the Spanish border. Of course, we know now he's going to the insane asylum, right? He soon realized, with the multitude of shaven heads, they must be Dominican or Capuchin monks. And then the king's chancellor, right, the manners was leading me by the hand was rather strange. He pushed me into a room and said, "You sit quiet and don't call yourself King Ferdinand or I'll beat the neck." This is the way they treated insane people, right? There was no empathy. There was no sympathy. There was no understanding. So the chancellor hit me across the back twice so painfully I almost let out a cry, but I didn't because it's customary among knights on initiation. He's being initiated. You see, this is a sad story. I'm laughing, but it's really a funny, sad story, isn't it? So he discovered China and Spain are the same. He's really off. The moon, only noses live on the moon. He goes to the council room, which is the whatever, it's the room in the insane asylum, and he orders the police force, rushed and ordered my police force, that's all the other inmates, to stand to prevent the earth from mounting the moon. It's going to be horrible. The monks I found in the state council said, "Gentlemen, let's save the moon. The earth is preparing to mount it." They started to rush to execute his royal wish, many climbing the wall to reach the moon. But at that moment, the Grand Chancellor came in. And as soon as they saw him, they scattered. But being the king, I stayed alone. But then the Chancellor hit him and chased him into his room. So much for popular tradition. And he's confused. They shave his head. They drip cold water on my head. And everything went blank. Right? Chinese water torture. You heard that? Never have I been through such hell. I just can't understand the point. Well, Jimmy, if he's in an insane asylum, how is he writing in his diary? Do they allow him to write in his diary? Whether or not that's true or not, he's writing in his diary, right? We have to believe he's right. This is him. This is him telling us what's going on in his head. And he's writing in his diary. He's writing in his diary. I think they allow him to write in his diary. And if they don't, we're in his head now. We're in his head. We've been in his head. Look up the Inquisition if you want to know what that was like. Now, all of a sudden, the Chancellor is the Grand Inquisitor. This is the scene we quoted before where he calls his name. and want to pour cold water. His damn stick hurts dreadfully. I found every rooster has his own spade. He has it in his feathers. Okay, this is the last entry. When I read this to you, I was very emotional when I read it because this is one of the most, and I know it's a translation, but it's one of the most deeply, deeply disturbing texts that I've ever read. You cannot help but really feel empathy for this character. Well, Jimmy, he's only a character in a book. Well, is he? You read about how other people lead their lives. This guy, whatever's going on in this guy's mind, we are actually gifted by Gogol to tell us this, to write like this. This is a gift. And if you read this again, and I'm not going to read it because I'll get emotional, but if you read it, the part where he's saying to his mother, "Save me, your wretched son, save me." He's being tortured, right? He's being tortured. Water's dripping on his head. He's being beaten. And is he insane? Well, he's insane, but do insane people deserve that? Does anybody deserve this? That's a tough question, isn't it, sometimes? And imagine the story not ending with a line like this. After this beautifully powerful, emotional passage, Gogol decides to end it with this. And by the way, have you heard that the Day of Algiers has a wart right under his nose? Which, bam, brings you right back to reality that this guy's nuts, right? Imagine the story ending here without that last line. You see, it would change everything. Every word a masterful craftsman like Gogol or any author does, controlling the narrator as he does, the story as he does, every word means something from the beginning of the story to the end of the story. Every word is literature charged with meaning. You can take any sentence, "There is the sky smoking before me." Take it out of here and look at it alone, right? There's the sky smoking before me. And it doesn't mean much, but you put it in context here with this other group of words, you suddenly have literature, and it's charged with meaning. 8,000 words in this story. Make it a short story. Unity of action. Diary of Madman meets this criteria. The conflict being the anonymous narrator versus society. He just doesn't fit in. And as a result, he ends up going mad. His interpretation of events confuse him, eventually tear him apart. And when he starts acting out what's on his mind, he gets into trouble. What's the theme? Well, there could be many themes. Don't be envious, be happy with what you have, blah, blah, blah. You figure out the theme you like. But remember, we read it to find out how other people lead their lives and how to lead ours. So if you do hear dogs talking, don't tell anyone. After December 8, what triggers him is the reading of the dog's letters. Confronting yourself about yourself is very difficult. It's very difficult. I had a banker who said to me one time many years ago, he says, "Jimmy, why don't you want people to know you own a business?" I said, well, because then they would treat me differently. They would have that, he owns a business. He must be, right, rich, well off, whatever. But that wasn't true if you know my business. If you know my business. It's not true if you own a business, you're always well off. Because a lot of businesses, first of all, many businesses that start, most of them fail. You can look at the statistics. And the reason they don't fail, there's obvious complex reasons. But I don't want people to treat me differently. And that's why I pressed myself against the wall. I don't really want to know, because then they wouldn't treat me as a consumer, as a regular person, as a dud, right? As another person. He says, I don't understand that, because I want everybody to know I'm the president of a bank. And I said, of course you do. because that's how you want to be treated as the president of a bank. But once you have that role as the president of a bank, you really miss out on a lot of the reality. People will not treat you the same way. They don't. Try it yourself. Try it yourself. If you live in a certain home, they'll treat you differently. They'll perceive you differently. If you don't live in a certain home, if you drive a certain car, you're perceived differently. But those perceptions are not always true, just like we found out in the Diary of a Madman. The civil servant's perceptions are not true. They're not. And when you start believing your own bullshit, sorry, it's not good because your perceptions may be wrong. Just saying. So we receive information through our senses. That's what shapes us. Is perception reality? Of course it is. Of course it is. Well, what if people think I'm a Yahoo? Oh, maybe you are. What if I'm not a Yahoo? I'm going to hit them. Well, maybe you shouldn't. These are difficult topics. The reason this is a great piece of literature is it challenges you to think about these topics, about perception and reality. There's nothing more important than perception and reality, because if you get the perceptions wrong and it doesn't match reality, you get in a whole mess of trouble, So he's a civil servant that copies documents. He sharpens quills. Can you be happy doing that? I think you could be happy doing anything if you put your mind to it. There is no shame in doing any type of work. Work is therapeutic. Well, Jimmy, all I do is pick up trash in the park. Well, it's great. Be a good trash picker-upper. It doesn't matter. What matters is you and your perceptions about yourself. Take pride in what you do, no matter what it is, but do it well. He's obviously uncomfortable with his position. But what does he do to change it? What does he do to change it? Does he take a course? Does he change jobs? Plot involves character development, right? According to Aristotle. He meets this. He develops through the story, right? We watch him slowly descend into madness when he can't contain his perceptions and start acting it out. We're almost done. Do you keep a diary and a journal? I think regardless of your age, you should start. I don't care if you're, 70 years old, 50 years old, 10 years old. First of all, if you're 10 years old and you're reading this story with me, I hope you can understand it. And kids today understand a lot of things. But anyway, you should keep a journal. Why? Because journals clarify your thoughts. They gives them time to emerge. When you write in longhand, you can type them out in a computer, but when you write in longhand, there's a certain length of time and a mystery that brings your thoughts to paper. I can't explain it with words. And you can reread your journal at a later date, and you've realized that the situation has changed, or it hasn't changed. You've changed. There's change going on. Personal note, Jimmy kept a journal since he was 17. 17 years old. I used to write a lot, especially when I was waiting to be drafted for Vietnam. And that's when they drew lottery numbers. They drew numbers, and if you had a low number, you would be called. And that year, I had a very low number. And that was right out of college, and no one would hire me because in those days they could say, "What's your number?" And you tell them, you go, "Oh, see you when you get back from Vietnam." It was a different age, ladies and gentlemen, different age. So I started to share with you one entry. I'm going to share one entry that's very personal, and rereading it now, so many years later, what I did when I reread this. And I don't do this often, but when you reread a journal entry, which now is very old, so it's it's decades old, that moment in time that you captured the journal entry comes alive. It's like you never left. You go back in time. If you record it right or wrong, but your perceptions. That's what a journal is. It's your personal perceptions. All right? Maybe you don't want to be bothered, so maybe you just shut down now. See you later. Hopefully you'll read another story. My life hangs from day to day as the dry last leaf before winter wind. I don't know if this is the last entry for 2 years if I get called, or forever if I die there. So, when you go, in those days, when you go to Vietnam, you die. You go in to die. So I had to come to terms with death. I had to tell myself that, I got to be prepared to die. Because that's all you heard about in the news is death. You go there. They didn't have movies yet, right? But you go there to fight and to die. I had friends who went there to die. Now, fast forward, foreshadowing, I never got called. I don't know why. I had the number, and the year passed, and I did not get called. I took the physical, I passed, I was ready to go, die, fight. I was looking at my hands, imagining for a moment what they would be like if I were 80. Because I knew I wouldn't reach 80, right? I must impose some kind of purpose to my life. It is sickening to live so long, I was 22 at the time, with nothing but self, waiting endlessly, waiting to be called. September is already almost gone, and I'm still here. But they say drafting will begin again next week. I hope so. I read something about Kant today. The first time in weeks I picked up a book. There is also, aside from the anxiety of waiting, a certain calm about the whole situation. I attempt to convince myself it no longer matters, but I fail each time. Why? What is it that keeps me from finally cracking? I simply haven't the strength in me to carry it through. Carry what? Why? The burden of being good, of course, of relying totally on myself and others. Instead, I cringe at reality. I shudder when I think of what I think I perceive. I am a coward, mentally as well as physically. There doesn't seem to be a solution in sight either. I'm tired, weak. I give myself up to fantasy, to television more and more, and yet even this is beginning to lose its attraction as a way out. Each time I give myself up to dreams, a voice reminds me of all to be done before I'm drafted. I used to cook for my parents while I was waiting to be drafted, living at home. I learned how to cook. I had to do something, so I actually taught myself to cook. I became a pretty good cook. And yet, this is the beginning of blah, blah, blah. Each time I end up inactive, stagnant, a piece of rock to be kicked about whoever and whatever is around, used as one uses salt. Ha! Jay, I promised to write a letter. Nothing. This mind of mine, it's a scourge, a pain-ridden thing that is me. I cannot be done with it now. No, not yet. The curse of a too cute awareness. I cannot begin to write the images that fly through me even as I am writing this. I can only give hints. The writer is a person who gives hints, clues, toward the real meaning of existing. His motive is himself, or rather, the pain in him. But to know this, to have this unbearable information, Montaigne is wrong. You cannot express certain ideas. They roam about as clouds. The writer is he who points to the approaches of obtaining these clouds for one's own. God, I need to be fully understood, but then maybe I wouldn't want that if it happened. For then, what would one do? It's just that there are times when I would just like to talk, to know that I am understood, but I can never consider this if I am without purpose or meaning, for there is nothing to understand when no meaning exists. When I'm drafted, they will give me meaning. They will teach me to kill or to be killed. Why? You might say I was a little off too, but that's what I was thinking at the time, right? Waiting to be drafted. So 1 year from that entry, I'd met my future wife and I wrote this poem in my journal. Let me share that with you because remember, I didn't get called. Come live with me that I might know and sense you as I do when. Near me through mazes unfolding as innocence and play, come live near me where I am living now. Allowing with a keen power I feast daily upon the darkness of your eyes. Swallowing sadness, drinking a fine pleasure, mystified in the lost emotion of your fluid steps, examining every line as a painter does his model. Come, for life is a canvas covered Van Gogh-like in thick, heavy tones of yellowish illusion, made reality for once, and at last, at long last. He sang, strumming softly his lyre like Homer. I'm over 70 now, married over 50, fired 3 times, built a business, employed 25 people, published articles, still wondering why I'm here. She's the reason. And another reason is to read classics with you. Thanks for listening. You've been reading with Jimmy. Gogol, Diary of a Madman. Thanks for staying around. Hope you enjoyed it. Go back and reread it again. It's full of insights. Otherwise, read something else. Thanks again. Jimmy at readingwithjimmy.com. Jimmy at readingwithjimmy.com. Thanks. Have a great day. Start a journal.